Hey, what's up guys? Tyler here with Secure Team. Well, if you remember earlier in the week, I had posted a video regarding a new film called Third Eye Spies, and how the film surrounded a physicist who back in the 1970s and 80s spearheaded a program that used people with psychic abilities, or what we now call remote viewing, to see deep into the future, the present, and the past. The program was such a success that even the CIA took notice. And for more than 20 years, the CIA used these psychic abilities operationally in a top secret spy program. Well, you paid for it and you deserve to know about it. And today, I am very excited to sit down with one of the founders that brought these shocking psychic abilities to light, physicist and remote viewing pioneer Russell Targ. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and if you've been on the fence or are skeptical about psychic abilities, specifically that of remote viewing, well, I think you guys are in for a big treat. Well, let's jump right into it. For the people who don't know, and I'd like to kind of conduct this interview as if I was a 5-year-old, and I'm just kind of learning about this topic, this phenomenon. So why don't we start off with an easy question, and if you could just describe, basically what is remote viewing and how is it done?
Remote viewing is the ability that we all have to quiet our minds and look into the distance and look into the future. And the most interesting thing about this is that it's a universal ability. You don't have to be a special person. We all have psychic abilities. And in our program, we found the most interesting thing that I can tell you is that it's no harder to look from California to Siberia than it is to look for California across the street. That is, increasing the distance does not degrade the accuracy or reliability. That made the CIA very happy, and we would call that a non-local ability. So the psychic spying we see in the laboratory is right on the beam with modern physics, which deals with non-local phenomena. And the other thing I can tell you is that it's no harder to describe something days or weeks in advance of it occurring than while it's going on. That is, we found that we could describe an atomic bomb test in China 3 days before it occurred and describe accurately the bomb test was taken place, but it failed. And Ingo Swann, great psychic, who is the inventor of remote viewing in our era, is the one who said, I see this beautiful colored curves in the space, and it looks like a fireworks display. The CIA, who was sitting with us, then knew, yes, he's looking at the right place. He's looking at the Chinese bomb test we're interested in, and not only that, he's forecasting that it's going to fail. Because if you try to test an atomic bomb and it doesn't go off, you just burn uranium in the atmosphere, and that makes a wonderful pyrotechnic display. And Ingo drew the pyrotechnic display, and indeed, 3 days later, we know from satellite photography that the Chinese did the bomb test, it did fail, and Ingo was able to describe that with 100% accuracy, 3 days in advance, 10,000 miles away.
Right. So, yeah, basically, guys, what Mr. Targ is speaking of here is, I guess you could basically say the remote viewing is a psychic ability. It's a practice where a person can sit in a room and they can get, I guess you would say, impressions or visions of something that is happening or happened very far away. It doesn't matter. It can be anywhere around the world. It can be in the past. And Ingo Swann, who you were just talking about, he was one of the, he's a pioneer, and I did a lot of early videos about him because he fascinated me so much. He and Pat Price, and in this new film that's called Third Eye Spies that's coming out, that is centered around you, as well as Hal Puthoff and these other remote viewers. Extremely well done film. I had a chance to sit down and watch it, and it was amazing. It was 2 hours of just learning things, 99% of which I didn't know. I mean, you can go online. A lot of people can think that these documentaries that are made these days, a lot of it's just rehashed material that you can find online, but I was extremely surprised, and I thought it was very refreshing to sit and be glued to the screen for 2 hours watching this film, learning about this psychic ability called remote viewing, and just the level of accuracy that you would see with these different remote viewers. One of them being Ingo Swann. We also had Pat Price. I'd like to ask, what event, I guess you could say, did your team remote view that got the attention of the CIA initially?
So we're talking about the true story of CIA psychic spying. And as you and I chatted beforehand, you were talking about abductions and UFOs and so forth. And I'm an old buddy of Jacques Vallée, so I'm read in on the UFO research. But in a certain sense, that what I'm talking about is not as far out as the things you usually talk about. I'm saying that a person can see into the distance, see into the future, experience what's going on there, can have an out-of-body experience, I was eager that nobody ever have a bad experience at SRI, because I'm a physicist. I'm not really qualified to take care of somebody who's freaking out over an experience. So we never invited anyone to separate their consciousness from their body. That's outside our job description. However, the continuum of remote viewing to out-of-body experiences where you can travel to a distant place and have an interaction with what's going on there. You can bring more of your sensitivity, sensuality, even sexuality to a different place, to a distant place, and you can have a whole body interaction with a person or a place thousands of miles away. And this is an ability that's available, and this is not an imaginary ability. We've published our findings in Nature magazine, the premier journal in the world, and my journal, where I normally publish laser stuff, the Proceedings of the Engineering Society. We published a whole monograph on 10 years of out-of-body experience and psychic abilities. So this is something that's really available to your viewers. They can learn to do this and quiet their minds and travel to distant places, even off the planet.
Right, and I was extremely surprised watching the film because, as you mentioned, we mainly talk about the government's cover-up of unexplained flying phenomenons and things like that. And that it's very hard to find. I mean, there is certainly evidence that there are strange things in our skies and in our, in space and possibly from other solar systems. But I was surprised to see that it actually seems after watching the film that there's way more concrete evidence to say that not only, like you said, is remote viewing real, but it's an ability that everyone has. I was shocked to watch this film and to learn about all of these different cases where all of these different remote viewers that had this psychic ability were able to, with pinpoint accuracy in most cases, find missing planes, locate things in Russia, and I understand that the CIA was very, very interested in that. Before we go, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so I'd like to ask, or at least talk to you about Pat Price a bit. In the film, Pat Price is spoken about a lot. He was another remote viewer with Ingo Swann. Now, Pat Price, besides just being a remote viewer, in your opinion, do you think that he may have been killed by the government or the CIA, because he did die, pretty young, and what was it, just a few months after he had left the operation? Did he pass? I mean, there's a lot of theories about what happened to Pat.
Well, let's lead up to that. Pat came to us as a volunteer remote viewer, and he agreed to look at some coordinates, which turned out to be the National Security Agency listening post in Virginia. This is a super secret crypto listening post, microwave searching the sky, listening. No, absolutely no one knew about. Nothing could be the most secret things going on in America is the work done by the by the National Security Agency, listening to Soviet microwaves bouncing off the moon. This was a top secret program. We were targeted on this sort of by accident. We were supposed to look at something adjacent to it. And when Price then described a super accurate place and actually read off the names of programs hidden in the basement, the CIA said, well, if you're so psychic, why didn't you look at the log cabin? Why did you look at this secret NSA site? And he said, well, in psychic space, the more effort you spend on hiding things, the more it shines like a beacon. So you directed me to the log cabin, but I was 5,000 feet up in the air looking down, and I saw this army base with all the antennas, and I just assumed that's where you wanted me to go. So he described this listening site, then penetrated into the building, described the filing cabinets, and most remarkable of all, read the files and named the program and the other activities going there. And that was top secret information. And that's one of the things that began to worry the CIA. If this nice old man, psychic guy with no clearance can read documents in the vault of the NSA, that means he might be able to read the nuclear launch codes in the pocket of the president and launch a nuclear war. This guy is a kind of psychic Superman because he can focus his attention anywhere on the planet.
Right. So, yeah.
One of the things we did with him is the Berkeley Police Department heard about our program and wanted help finding Patricia Hearst when she was kidnapped in 1974. So Pat Price and I and my partner Hal Putoff drove to Berkeley, and the Berkeley police said, well, we got a lot of questions we want to ask you. We know you used to be a policeman, Mr. Price. And Price said, let me show you how we do this. Just give me your mug book, the big picture book with all the people you've arrested in the last few years, and I want to see your mug book. So I stood there. Hal and I and another guy stood next to a big oak table. Price turned the page after page, and then he put his finger on a guy whose name turned out to be Donald DeVries and said, that guy's the ringleader. And the police said, well, we know who that is. He escaped from a low-security prison a year ago. And Price said, well, he's the ringleader of this group, and this is not for money. This is a political crime. But I suppose you don't need to know that now. What you'd like is a car, said Price. He said, the car is about 50 miles north of here, the kidnapped car. It's on the left side of the road toward the bay, across from some gas storage tanks. And as we stood there, the police in Berkeley launched a cruiser. They found the car just where Price said it would be. There's still shells, cartridges in the car. Of course, the kidnappers had left the car already, but we were able to identify the ringleader before anyone had ever heard his name, and then Price found the car. So that's the sort of thing we did for a decade at SRI.
Right, and that was just one of many of the amazing cases where these remote viewers, people that knew nothing about these cases, are sitting in a room. And as you said, Pat, he was investigating, trying to help out with the investigation, what happened to Patty Hearst. Yeah, picked Donald DeVries out of the mugshot book, and that was totally amazing. Helped find the car. And, there's another, I don't want to give too many away from the film, but
that's one of the most psychic things I've ever seen. Standing with Price, no one in the room had any idea who the kidnapper was. No one knew. And he just turned the pages and said, that's your man.
Was it the first one in the mug book he pointed to? Very first picture?
Right. That's the only one. He put his finger on he also said there's something about a wolf There's something about a Lobo, and one of the other kidnappers was named Willie Wolf.
Yeah, it's amazing. I could not believe, I went into the film thinking, well, and a lot of people, when I told them earlier in the week that we're going to be doing this interview, I mentioned remote viewing, and a fair amount of people knew what remote viewing was, and they even referenced in the comments of the video that yes, indeed, everyone can do it. But we also had a fair amount of people saying, well, this ability, so-called ability, what is the difference between it and a magician being able to read what's in a sealed envelope? And I do know that you did magic as a kid, as described in the film, but I would respond to those people who say, well, what's the difference between remote viewing and someone doing a magic trick, was the fact that it was funded by the government through, what was it, it went through five presidential administrations, funded for 20 years. So that has to say something about how real this ability was.
That's right. The difference between what we're doing and a magic trick is the magic trick is a deception where the thing you're seeing is not conducted in a court. You're being deceived. And I did magic amateur for some time, and the difference between the so-called effect and the trick. The effect is what the audience sees. The trick is what you're really doing, which they don't see. Now, the CIA is not easily amused, and the best evidence we have of the reality of what we were doing is that the CIA supported us for 20 years, $1 million or more a year, to find downed airplanes, submarines, kidnap people. We were involved with describing Ambassador Queen, who was kidnapped by the Iranian students. And we were given a picture once in an envelope. We didn't know what it was. And the psychic was asked by the Navy Chief of Staff, can you tell me about the guy in this envelope? And the psychic said, well, this man is very sick. He's in the dark. He can hardly walk. He looks like he's going to die. But as I look at him, I see him walking out of this place into the sun and getting on an airplane. That's what I see. 2 days later, we learned that our subject was Ambassador Richard Queen. He was in fact dying of multiple sclerosis. The Iranians wanted to get rid of him so he didn't die on their watch. They released him, and 2 days later, he was on an airplane flying to Augsburg, Germany. So again, psychic was able to look into the miserable kidnap place in Iran, see the guy, see that he had gotten sick, and then discern that he would be out of there in 2 days flying on an airplane. It's not a magic trick.
Right, and it was also refreshing to see in the film that, a lot of these remote viewing sessions, especially with Ingo and Pat, they were done in very controlled sort of laboratory conditions, and I saw that, if one of the remote viewers saw that there was, something that would even lead someone to believe possibly that this could be some sort of trick or something, or a loophole, they would tell them to stop and fix that before they would go any further, because they didn't want a shred of doubt that this was some sort of trick. And that was truly amazing, because usually when you have someone in there trying to pull a trick, they won't voluntarily point out the loopholes that could expose them. So that was extremely refreshing. And for those of you out there who think this, maybe you're still on the fence a little bit, as Russell mentioned earlier, some of the things that were accurately remote viewed. We had a Chinese A-bomb test that Ingo Swan witnessed or remote viewed 3 days in advance before it happened. We had the Patty Hearst case. We had the Russian bomber that was lost in the Congo in Africa that was also found by remote viewing. What was it, within a mile of where the actual plane was? It was described
very close to where the plane was. And again, that's one of the instances where we have testimony from the President of the United States. Our film opens with Jimmy Carter saying the psychics in California found this bomber, which was a Russian Tupolev bomber, which had crashed in Zaire, and the Americans couldn't find it because satellites don't see through the jungle. So we got one of our psychics who was able to see where it was, mark a map, and then the CIA launched a helicopter to land within the circle that she drew. And as a helicopter landed in that circle, natives were coming by dragging metal from the wreckage, which was a couple of miles away in the river. And her other psychic, in fact, said that it was in the river and drew that picture. And Carter is on camera saying, this is the most remarkable thing that ever happened.
So in your opinion, do you think the remote viewing of the Soviet weapons factory was probably the most impressive in your opinion, or is there a single case that was the most impressive remote viewing? Was Pat Price and Ingo Swann on the same level in your opinion, or who would you say was the most prolific remote viewer?
They did different things. Let me answer your first question. When Pat Price described, I was always on the scene. I was the interviewer. My vision is very poor, so I don't get to drive anywhere. So my job was always to sit with the viewer, the subject, in the dark and help him get in touch with his psychic abilities. I'm not doing anything psychic, but I'm helping to keep him on the beam and not have him start guessing. So with Price, he drew this giant crane. He said, I'm lying on a building and this giant crane, A-frame gantry, is rolling back and forth over my body. And the CIA did have satellite pictures of that giant crane. So he drew a superb picture of a crane at the site. So the CIA said, okay, you're looking at the right place. What are they doing there? What are they making with all this high power equipment? And Price said, well, underground, they're fabricating giant 60-foot diameter steel spheres, and they're going to use that as some kind of containment vessel. And the CIA said, well, that's very interesting. We don't know anything about that. But Price said, they're putting these spheres together, making sort of orange peel slices, and then welding these big slices together. And the CIA said, well, we don't know anything about that either. 2 years later, when the Russians opened up that building, the spheres that Price drew and described were exactly as he drew them. So this is a case where no one could have whispered the answer because nobody in the Western world knew about these things. And in fact, no one knew about it until after Price's death. So he couldn't even look in the answer book. So this is a case where Price described something very accurately, and it was not be able to confirm until 2 years later. So this is the answer to the question, did somebody know about it? Did somebody tip him off? Did he look in the psychic internet? And the answer is no, no one knew anything about it. In fact, the CIA was so impressed and frightened by the fact that they have Superman here in California hanging out with the hippies that they took him from California to Virginia and hired him as a contractor for the CIA. So we've had Price with us for 3 years, and then the CIA sort of snatched him away and said that the answer is, I don't want to repeat myself, we say it in the film, that the CIA was frightened of somebody who was functioning like Superman hanging out with people in California who are too much of a believer. Now, I had a personal lifetime experience with psychic stuff, so I was not a believer. It's like my earlier life was with lasers. If somebody says, I don't believe in lasers, I'll show them a fire brick and drill a hole in the fire brick with my laser and say, do you believe in lasers now? It's right here. And Price describing the Russian spheres, Price describing the Russian spheres was a completely out of bounds, amazing thing for him to do. And the CIA said, we got to get this guy where he's in control, not just hanging out with Targ in the dark in California. And it was just 4 months after Price went to work for the CIA that he died mysteriously. We know that while he was with Price, we know that while Price was with the CIA, he was doing operational psychic tasks every day, because that's described on camera. That is, in Third Eye Spies, we have the CIA on camera saying that, yes, Price was able to see into the code room in a Libyan embassy, and he could go in that code room and describe what was there, and work at the CIA with 2 other CIA agents that I trained. And 2 days after he was in the code room, he mysteriously died. Now, Price was 57 years old, so at that time he seemed like an old man to me. I'm now 30 years older than that, and he doesn't seem so old anymore. And we knew that he had a heart condition, but he was a cheerful, energetic guy. When the CIA brought him to Virginia, they made him head of a farm. So the last time I saw Price, he was in his overalls with a pitchfork, pitching hay in his farm that he was running as a cover.
Right.
But he then died mysteriously.
Right. And that the circumstances around his death, the way he was found, the way they went about it, and then told his wife, again, I don't want to give too many details away, because I think the film does a wonderful job of going into that detail. It's obvious that the CIA and the government, they wanted remote viewers. The program went on for 20 years. So then it was later on, fast forwarding here, it was eventually terminated. And then we had this Ted Koppel interview. There was a TV show, an episode with Ted Koppel in 1995, where this guy, Robert Gates, the director of defense, who went on and basically said, there's nothing to this. There's nothing that he has seen. I think his exact words may have been that it was not useful for intelligence ops. Now, why do you think that all of a sudden the CIA is coming out and basically saying that it's all a sham? Is it to hide the fact that they were still using it, and that it was real? Or do you think there was some ulterior motive behind Gates and these other guys, suddenly coming out and saying, hey, there's nothing to this ability?
Well, the thing that triggered that is I was sitting with Joe McMoneagle in the film. Joe is one of the great Army remote viewers. I trained up 6 guys who are Army intelligence people who were in the Army and volunteered to become remote viewers, and they set up a Army psychic corps in Maryland. And Joe was one of those people, McMoneagle. He's still alive, and he was a outstanding, remarkable remote viewer. He described a Soviet submarine under construction, and he said, this is the largest submarine that there's ever been. This is a 500-foot submarine, and he made a little drawing. He said, this is twice as big as any other submarine that's ever been built, and it's built by pushing the hulls of 2 cylindrical submarines together to make something twice as long, twice as wide. And he drew that and published it. That is, it was part of it received publication. People knew that he had done that. And Gates said, we don't know anything about that. Nothing like that was ever useful to us, even though Price described the launch of the submarine correctly 3 months before it was launched. And I sat with Joe watching this interview on camera, and Joe said the man is just lying. That he knows that, in fact, he told the Army Corps that it was just Joe's lucky day that he picked the right thing. No one denied that Joe had accurately described this brand new phenomenal submarine, but Gates is on camera with Ted Koppel just lying his ass off, saying that we never told them anything they didn't know, which is absolutely untrue, because the Army group, at risk of getting inside baseball here, the Army group was in business for 20 years doing operational remote viewing principally for the CIA. So the CIA was paying the tab on these 8 or 10 Army psychics who were doing operational things for the CIA. So just a big lie saying that we weren't providing useful information.
Right, right. Do you think, well, I mean, my belief is that because this program was obviously such a success, I would have to think that at least the U.S. government, we know that the Russians were heavily into this, had remote viewers of their own. I would think that even today, the U.S. government would still have to be practicing remote viewing operationally at at one form or another. I would have to believe that, because after seeing the film, it was just amazing, the accuracy. And I think, again, a reason that they would likely, someone like Gates would come out on national television and say this is hogwash, was because they don't want people to know that everybody has this ability. Because in the film, it showed, they did a little experiment with a group of average everyday people, and I was amazed by the accuracy that these just normal people who came in off the street after a little bit of training were able to produce in their own remote viewing session. So I definitely think that the government is doing what they do best. When they have a secret, they come out and say, hey, it's hogwash, and they've been doing that with UFOs for years.
I don't mean to be silly about that. Some people are more psychic than others. It's like musical ability. If you want to learn to play the piano, it's extremely likely that if you work with a teacher for a half a year, you will be able to play the piano starting from no talent, no experience at all. However, that won't get you to Carnegie Hall no matter how hard you try. So there's a range of abilities from people who are just very gifted and start playing brilliantly as a child, and I know one of those also, to people who spend a lot of time trying to learn to play the piano and was unsuccessful, and that would be me. But all of us can learn to do something. You can play a little jazz, you can play something on the piano, because it's an ability that corresponds to what we can do. So psychic ability is like that. We have an Ingo Swann and Pat Price and Joe McMoneagle, and I don't want to forget Hella Hammond. Hella's worth describing a little. Hella was my dear friend for many years from New York, and at one point, the CIA said, can you find a control subject, somebody who had never done this before, who would work with us? And I told Hella about this. Hella was a photographer, very highly intelligent woman, cultivated, and she thought it would be very entertaining to be paid to do ESP for the CIA in Palo Alto and hang out with me and my family. So she thought she did that as a lark. And our first trial, she and I were sitting in our little comfortable remote viewing cubicle. And I said, well, Hal is hiding someplace now. She said, well, what do I do? And I said to her, as I always say to people, just take a couple of deep breaths, quiet your mind, however you'll do that, and look for surprising images to show up. And you're looking for you're not guessing, you're just looking for surprising images. And she said, well, I see an unusual construction up in the air. There's squares within squares within squares. And it turned out Hal had been sent by a random procedure we used. He was sent to a pedestrian overpass across the freeway. And if you look at the photographs that we took of where he was standing, and this appears in the film, it's a remarkably accurate match to what she drew. And this was her #1 trial. So the surprising thing that has to be told is that we then did 9 trials with Hella, replicating the 9 trials we did with Pat Price. Pat was highly successful, so that in his 9 trials where we were trying to describe where he was hiding, he got 7 out of 9 first places. What that means is if he was kidnapped 9 days in a row, we would have found him. well, if Hal had been kidnapped 9 days in a row, Pat Price would have found him the first place he looked 7 out of those 9 times. And that's highly significant. It's out of the 1 in 100,000. And that was publishable. That was such a strong result that we published that in Nature. Then Hella came along 2 years later, our control subject, did 9 more trials, and Hella's drawings were even more accurate than Price's, and her results were significant at odds of 1 in a million. So you got to hear in one sentence, the control person who had never done this before came in off the street, learned remote viewing, became 10 times more significant in an experiment than the most psychic man in the world. And that should inspire your viewers to try and do this.
I have no doubt they will. They even without seeing the film, just from hearing this interview, and I know for a fact that many of them already are, as they told me in the comments of the video where I had told them I'd be doing this interview. Now, this is a very strange ability because, as I've seen and read, there are certain instances where you'll have a remote viewer and he will accurately describe a location. There was one case where he had described a few objects or buildings that he saw in his visions that were there, but was later told, well, these aren't there. You were incorrect. These buildings are not there. But later on, it was found out that these buildings had been there, but they had just been there, 30, 40, 70 years before that and had been demolished. So would you agree that remote viewing, or remote viewers are able to view not just the present, but also the future and the past?
They can definitely describe the present, the future, and the past. It's a non-local ability, and what you have to learn is to focus your attention where you want to look. Pat Price, in one of the early trials with Pat Price, our contract monitor, Kit Green, went to a swimming pool complex about 5 miles south of SRI, and Price was sitting with me in our little shielded room, and he said, it looks like a water purification plant. The rectangular body of water, 60 by 80, and the round body of water about 100 feet in diameter, and there are these 2 giant water tanks, which he drew. So a half hour later, we all went to the swimming pool complex. His drawing of the 2 swimming pools, 60 by 80 and 100 feet in diameter, was exactly correct. It was as though he had made a plan view of what's actually there.
Right.
But of course, there's no water tanks. So we said that this is some kind of analytical overlay. Price guessed that it was a water purification plant, and he made up the water tanks to go with it. That was very disrespectful because Price was a great viewer. 10 years later, the city of Palo Alto sent the residents a picture book of what the city looked like 100 years ago. And 75 years before Price made his drawing, this was a water purification plant. There were 2 giant water tanks there. In fact, those 2 water towers, which are shown in the photograph and shown in our movie, would have been the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto. They were just no longer at that site, just as you pointed out. So he described where the contract monitor was hiding quite correctly with the swimming pools and added in the big thing that used to be there but is not there anymore.
Right, and I think that illustrated wonderfully the fact that remote viewing, in my opinion, it's not just seeing something in the present. You can see things that have been there in the past or happened in the past and the future, and that begs the question, does remote viewing show us that time and space are merely an illusion? Many people believe that we're in a holographic simulation and that time and space aren't real. Do you have an opinion on that matter as far as time and space?
I don't think that time and space are an illusion or a hologram. I'm an unreconstructed physicist. I'm a logical positivist. I do experiments for a living. I build stuff. And I know that our equations of space and time actually work quite well. However, from the data of remote viewing, it's obvious that we somewhat misapprehend the nature of the space-time we live in. There's more going on. So we have some things correct, and we don't deal with other things. And this is ordinary in physics. In the 19th century, Maxwell described how electromagnetic systems work, that light and electricity are the same thing. And then Einstein came along in 1900 and said, well, actually, more than that's going on. And then Planck came along and said, well, that's not exactly correct. Things are divided in little particles. And 50 years later, John Bell came along and said, there's actually no separation. Things are entangled. And people don't freak out. Physics doesn't fall apart. We don't burn the books. We say, well, that was interesting. We missed something. There's something more to add. And that's the way physics works. That's why it's interesting. Otherwise, physics would be boring.
Right. We're always getting new answers. And I always tell the viewers, what we think we know about science and physics today changes. Every 5 to 10 years, we learn something new, or we get better data. And it's always changing. So, I think there are many mysteries to our universe and to reality that we'll learn about as time goes on. Now, speaking of time and space, well, more importantly, space, Ingo Swann famously, I think it was in his book Penetration, it may have been, but it's said, and I wanted to ask you about this, well, it's two things. I want to start with Ingo. He said that he remote viewed what he thought were some sort of bases, possibly alien bases on the backside of the moon, that he mentioned it, but that it worried him. It made him very, it was very disconcerting what he said he saw. And then you had mentioned, I believe that Pat also had remote viewed either UFOs or alien bases, and that he passed that information up. So have you had any experiences, since you know these men personally, you knew these men, regarding them remote viewing aliens, UFOs, or just strange things in our skies that they may have passed on to the upper levels of the government?
Well, Ingo was a great psychic. He was able to quiet his mind and describe rings of ice around Jupiter 6 months before the Pioneer spacecraft got there.
Right.
So Ingo is not bound to the planet. He was able to look 500 million miles away instantaneously and see the rings around Jupiter that no one had ever known about before. So that's a testimony to his prodigious ability. And there's no doubt about that. And his awareness led us to do this program, this remote viewing program, rather than card guessing or some other thing that does not work as well as remote viewing. So Ingo is really the father of remote viewing in the modern era. Now, with regard to bases on the other side of the moon, I don't know any more about it than you. I know that Ingo was a science fiction writer. In addition, he had a very fertile mind. He wrote a number of books about different kinds of things that he experienced psychically,
Right.
which we don't know anything about.
Right.
I mean, people have been to the other side of the moon now. The Russians and the Americans and the Chinese have seen the dark side of the moon. They may not be telling, and we'll learn in a few years if Ingo's structures were there.
Right.
Price came to see us one day and said, I've been looking around for UFO bases, and I found 4 bases on the terrestrial planet. There are bases where construction and repairs are being made at Mount Hayes in Alaska, in the Pyrenees Mountains in Australia, and in South America. And of course, we sent in these documents to the CIA, and CIA said, well, that place where Price marked in Australia has been a site of frequent UFOs. And as I was preparing to talk to you, I looked up Mount Hayes, which of course I didn't know anything about. But Mount Hayes is a tall mountain in Alaska, which is famous these years, now 40 years after Price, it has become a hotbed for UFO activity, and my little internet search led to all sorts of good-looking UFO pictures up above Mount Hayes, which Price named as a UFO base in Alaska.
And that's right. I mean, the evidence that something is in our skies, whether it's from something off planet or it's our own technology, we don't know. But there certainly is evidence that there's something going on. The Pentagon, there was the recent exposing of the Pentagon's UFO hunting program, the fact that these things were coming out of the sky and stalking aircraft carriers. There's fighter jet footage of them chasing these things. So I would definitely have to think that if Inco could go off planet and correctly predict or see that there were rings around Jupiter before a probe was there, I would certainly think that he would have the ability to see what was on the moon, and maybe he did. Maybe he told the government. Maybe they're keeping a secret the way they keep secrets about everything. One thing I found out is the more extreme the topic, the more tight the government holds it and keeps it under lock and key. So it would not surprise me.
Well, that's one of the important things about this film. This is not just a documentary film. The film we've made, this Third Eye Spies, is really an event because we're talking about psychic spying and ESP in the laboratory, and we have the CIA contract monitors, the scientists who oversaw our program for 20 years. We have Kit Green and Ken Kress, senior CIA operators. Ken Kress is a senior physicist, lifelong physicist at the CIA. Kit Green was the head of the Life Science Division. And both of these scientists are on camera throughout the film saying, yes, we've been polygraphed, and I want to tell you the things that Targ is describing actually exist, and we were there to see it. So the testimonial from the CIA operators who oversaw the program for 2 decades coming on camera saying it really happened is what really validates what we're talking about.
It's amazing. It's an amazing film. And before we go today, I'd like to ask, what are your future plans? You've just got this film done. What are your plans as far as furthering this cause? Is it just to spread awareness about remote viewing? And if there's just one thing you could leave my viewers with today, what would that be regarding this ability and what you'd like them to know?
Well, the one thing that I would leave your viewers with the idea is that there's more to you than just meat and potatoes. That the Buddhists have, the important thing that I want to leave you with is that remote viewing is not New Age. That this has been understood and practiced for 2,500 years. The Hindu Patanjali, the great Dharma master, wrote in his sutras, he said that if you quiet your mind, you can see into the future, see into the distance, heal the sick, and diagnose illnesses. And he has a chapter of a famous book that he wrote 400 years before Christ, how to do it, and that it's available. And the Buddhists have been teaching for hundreds of years that your nature is timeless awareness. What that means is that when you quiet your mind, you're able to move your consciousness out of the physical body, into the distance, into the future, and experience what's going on there. And that's Buddhist lore for 2,000 years. And again, many of the Buddhist teachings describe how to meditate and how to have that experience. So this is no longer a secret. In fact, a funny story is these Buddhist texts used to be secret within Buddhism, and what they've decided is that if people are willing to figure out the text, then they deserve to have the ability. So they describe these famous texts as self-secret. By and large, people are not going to take the trouble to discover who they are, but if you want to discover who you are, it's available to learn to quiet your mind and discover your nature as timeless awareness. And that is, your consciousness is independent of space and time, and therefore your consciousness is not run by cause and effect.
Right.
You're free of the things that normally force you. You have more freedom than you think.
Right, right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Russell Targ here, who this new film, Third Eye Spy, surrounds. Now, I want you guys to head out and check out this film. Now, I know some of you may think, hey, Tyler's just spouting off about a film and he may not like it, but I'm telling you guys right now, this was an amazing film. I learned so much. You know, I went in skeptical, and I think many people do, and it's good to be skeptical, but by the end of the film, I can honestly say that I have no doubt that this psychic ability is real. Some of the things in this film, you know, the things that they remote viewed, that they got correctly, the accuracy, the fact that the government funded this for 20 years, it's amazing stuff. And if you want to learn more about it, I'm going to put some links below so you can pre-order the film, order the film. Check it out if you can, if you have time. I promise it's definitely worth it. Thank you, Russell, for being here. This really meant a lot.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No problem. We do hope to have you back really soon. So thank you, sir, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.